אילו פינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. ואילו פינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלכנו. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלכנו.
אילו פינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. ואילו פינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות
זיו העולם, נפשי חולת, אהבתך אנה אלנם, רפנה לה, בהרעות לה, נועם זיווך, אז תתחזק ותתרפא והייתלך שפחת עולם, היגלנה ופרוס חביב עלי את סוכת שלומך תאיר ארץ מכבודך נגילה ונשמחה בך מהר אהוב כי במועד וכוננים כימי עולם.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm so happy and honored to be here with everyone this week on Parsha Va'era, where a little bit later tonight we'll be discussing, this is the first of several parshiot or portions in the Torah that describe the mechanics of the exodus from Egypt. And fortuitously, as we'll discuss a little later, every single year during MLK Day, it actually falls out during one of the portions of the Exodus, and all of the parallels and inspiration of our central story, the Exodus, has been something that's been inspirational and powering moral change and progress in the world really from the outset. The first thing we do to welcome in Shabbat is light the Shabbat candles. So I'd like to invite Judy Kansigar to say the blessing and light for us.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu v'hadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to light the Sabbath candles.
Amen. We turn to page 130 for Lechuna Ranana.
Lechuna Ranana Ladonai Nari Alitzur Ishenu Nekadma Fanav Betoda Bizmirot Nari Alo Nekadma Fanav Betoda Bizmirot Nari Alon Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash Shiru Ladonai Kol Haaretz Shiru Ladonai Baruchu Shemo Pasro miyom leyom Yeshuato Sapru v'goyim kevodo Bechol ha'amim niflotav
In the next step of the Kabbalat Shabbat service in Zamru, we describe different parts of nature as if they're so excited about Shabbat that they can barely contain their excitement. We talk about the sea, we talk about the rivers, and all sorts of natural wonders. Zamru, page 134.
זמרו לאדוני בכינור, בכינור וכל זמרה, בחצוצרות וקול שופר, הריעו לפני המלך אדוני, ירם הים ומנור, תבל ויושבי בה, הידי נהרות, עמך כף יחד, ערים ירננו, לפני אדוני קיווה, לשפוט הארץ, ישפוט תבל בצדק, ועמים במישרים. ירם הים ומנור, תבל ויושבי בה, הידי נהרות, עמך כף יחד, הרים ירננו, כף יחד, הרים ירננו.
We turn the page for Mizmor LeDavid.
מזמור לדוד, הבו לאדוני בני אלים, הבו לאדוני כבוד ועוז, הבו לאדוני כבוד שמו, השתחוו אדוני בהדרת קודש, כל אדוני על המים, אל הכבוד הרים, אדוני, אדוני, המים רבים, כל אדוני בכוח, כל אדוני בהדר, כל אדוני שובר ארזים, וישבר אדוני את ארזי הלבנון, ויקידם כמו עגל לבנון, וסיריון כמו Shalom.
We now turn our attention to the imagery as Shabbat personified as a bride in Lecha Dodi on page 138.
Lecha Dodi לקראת כלה, בני שבת נקבלה, שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד השמיענו, אל המיוחד אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. lecha dodi לקראת כלה, בני שבת נקבלה, לקראת שבת לכו ונרחקים מקור הברכה מראש מקדם, נסוכה סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. lecha dodi לקראת כלה, בני שבת נקבלה, התעוררי התעוררי כי באורך, קומי אורי אורי אורי, שיר דברי כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. lecha dodi לקראת כלה, בני שבת נקבלה, איי 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 lecha dodi, איי 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 לקראת כלה, איי איי בני שבת בני שבת בני שבת נקבלה. לא תבושי ולא תגמי, מה תשתוכחי ומה תמי, בך יחסו אני עמי ונבנתה ירדתי לה. איי 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 lecha dodi, איי 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 לקראת כלה, איי איי בני שבת בני שבת בני שבת נקבלה. בואי ושלום עטרת בלה, גם בשמחה ובצונה, תוך אמוני עם סגולה. בואי חלה בואי חלה, איי איי lecha dodi, איי 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 לקראת כלה, איי איי בני שבת בני שבת בני שבת נקבלה.
For our final song of Kabbalat Shabbat, before we start the Arvit service, we turn to page 140 for Mizmor Shir.
מזמור שיר ליום השבת, טוב להודות לאדוני ולזמר לשמך עליון, ולזמר לשמך עליון, להגיד בבוקר חסדך ואמונתך בלילות, עלי עשור ועלי נבל, עלי היגיון וכינון, צדיק כתמר יפרח, כארז בלבנון יזכה,
We turn to page 146 for Baruch Hu. If you are able to, please rise in whatever capacity.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamevorach.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Va'ed. We continue on page 148. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidvo mariv aravim bechachma poteach she'arim uvetura mishnei itim umachlif et hazmanim umesader et kochavim b'mishrateim berakir kiritzono borei yom v'layla golal or mipnei choshech v'choshech mipnei or umavir yom umei v'layla umavyo min yom v'layla Adonai tzavot shemaho El Chai v'Kayam Tamid Yimoch Aleinu Li'olam Va'ed Baruch Atah Adonai Hamariv Aravim. We turn to page 150, and before we sing the Ahavat Olam, which translates to the everlasting love, we take a moment after a long week and meditate for just a minute on what would happen if we were each able to just increase the amount of love we have for everything and everyone around us just a little bit. We know that the potential of love, as Ahavat Olam teaches us, is really everlasting and infinite. And one of the beautiful things is that it means that there's always room to grow. Ahavat Olam Beit Israel Amecha Ahavta Torah u'mitzvot, chukim u'mishpatim otanu limdata, al ken Adonai Eloheinu b'shkavenu uv'kumenu, nasiach bechukacha, v'nismach b'divrei toratecha u'b'mitzvotecha le'olam va'ed, ki hem chayenu v'orach yemenu, v'hem negeh yomam v'layla, v'avatacha al tishem mimenu le'olamim, Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. Page 152 for Shema.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We continue on page 154 with Ve'ahavta. Please join me. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha ve'hayu ha'devarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת.
Adonai Elohechem Emet. We continue on page 156. Emet ve'emunah kol zot v'kayim aleinu ki hu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ein zulato ve'anachnu Yisrael amo. You are our sovereign and savior, who delivers us from oppressors' hands and saves us from tyrants' fists. You work wonders without number, marvels beyond count. You give us life and steady our footsteps. You perform miracles for us before Pharaoh, signs and wonders in the land of the Egyptians. You led your people Israel out from their midst to freedom for all time. When your children witnessed your presence, they praised your name in gratitude, and they accepted your sovereignty. Moses, Miriam, and all Israel sing to you, lifting their voices joyously. Mi Chamocha on page 158.
Yalai, 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 hi, lai, lalai. Hi, lai, yalai, lai, 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 lai. Yalai, 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 hi, lai, lalai. Hi, lai, yalai, lai, 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 lai. Yalai, lai, yalai, 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 hi, lai, lalai. Yalai, yalai, lai, 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 lai. Yalai, 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 hi, lai, lalai. Ay lay la 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 lay Mi chamocha bailim Adonai Mi kamocha nehedar bakodesh Nora tehilot osef ele Nora tehilot osef ele Ay lay rai machutecha Ra'u vanecha Bokei hayam lifnei Moshe uMiriam Ze Elianu Adonai yimloch le'olam ba'ed v'ne'ema kivada Adonai et Yaakov u'galom yad chazak mimenu baruch ata Adonai Ga'al Yisrael.
Amen. Hashkivenu on page 160.
Ushmot tzitenu uvoenu lechaim uleshalom me'ata ve'ad olam ufros aleinu sukat shalom Baruch atah Adonai haborei sukat shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael ve'al Yerushalayim. Shamro b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ את הארץ וביום השביעי וביום השביעי שבת וינפש.
We rise and turn to page 164 for the Amidah.
Adonai sfatai tiftach
Oseh shalom min Ramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imvru amen. We turn to page 371 for the Mishuberach, and we keep in mind anyone that's in need of healing, whether it's due to the COVID pandemic or any other type of illness, be it physical, spiritual, mental, anyone suffering from any type of addiction, or really just anyone and anything that's in need of healing this Shabbat. Mishuberach, page 371.
Misheberach Avotenu Mekor habracha Leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misheberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Amen. Joachim Prinz was born in the year 1902 in a small village in East Germany that was not known for its Jewish population. He was born to an assimilated Jewish family, and at a young age, he had an extremely difficult relationship with his father. His father owned a business. His father was a strict businessman. And according to a lot of early accounts, Prinz was more focused on philosophy. He was more focused on ideas. When Prinz was a teenager, his mother tragically passed away, and that sparked his family moving away from this small village in East Germany to a major city in the east of Germany. And after his mother's death, Prinz decided that he wanted to rebel against his father. And he did so in the way that Jewish children have been rebelling against their Jewish parents for hundreds of years. Joachim Prinz decided that he would go to seminary and become a rabbi. So at age 21, Joachim Prinz, after completing a PhD in philosophy, became a rabbi and quickly became one of the most sought after preachers, orators, and Jewish thinkers all around Germany. Eventually, in the early 1930s, landing a job as the chief rabbi in the largest synagogue in Berlin. Lucky enough, when the Nazis rose to power in the early 1930s, before the final solution, they decided that they were going to kick out of the country and expel anybody who they thought was a Jewish communal leader, anybody who they thought could gather and excite Jews to participate in Jewish tradition. So in 1937, Joachim Prinz was kicked out. He was expelled out of his hometown or his home country, Germany. He was expelled out of Berlin, and he found himself in the United States of America, where over the next couple of years, he had to sadly watch in horror as we know what ended up happening in Germany and all throughout Europe. As a result of this, Joachim Prinz decided that he would dedicate the rest of his life to two ideas. First, he worked tirelessly for the Zionist movement. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the Jewish people would have a homeland, that they would have political autonomy, that they would have some sort of safe haven, lest or in case something like Hitler's regime could ever happen again. But Joachim Prinz was also focused on a universal message. He was focused in America on being a civil rights icon who worked tirelessly throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, fighting for equal rights for everyone in America. In the March on Washington, perhaps one of the most famous events in civil rights history in America, Rabbi Joachim Prinz had the honor and privilege to be the speaker right before Martin Luther King Jr. Joachim Prinz focused on two aspects of both Jewish tradition and of his own life in describing why, hey, a rabbi that was born in a different country thought that it was worth his life mission to be in America fighting for civil rights. First, he talked about the ethics of Judaism. And he talked about something that underscores our entire tradition, the idea that all humans, no matter who they are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. This idea led Rabbi Joachim Prinz to look around the world and point out something that he thought was obvious, but sadly wasn't seen as obvious at the time, that no one person or no one group of people are any better or worse than another. But Joachim Prinz also focused on memory, both his own memory of growing up in a Europe that was liberal, that was progressive, watching it both in the early 30s when he lived there and on the sidelines from America, how it so quickly seemed to go from light into darkness, but also the past Jewish memory, the universal Jewish memory of the Exodus, of a people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people, knowing what it's like to be oppressed, knowing what it's like to go through that long journey from slavery to freedom, something that's ubiquitous in our tradition. As we said before, fortuitously, the way that the American and Jewish calendars line up, MLK weekend always falls out during one of the 3 or 4 Torah portions that have to do with the Exodus. And we know that Martin Luther King Jr., a deeply religious thinker, was equally motivated and inspired by the story of the Exodus. The idea that God, the most powerful being in the universe, would care enough to take a slave-ridden people, the lowest of the societal totem pole, and perform miracles and wonders, as we learn in this week's Torah portion, the 10 plagues, perform miracles and wonders to lead them to their freedom, inspired Martin Luther King Jr. to advocate for all peoples in America, the civil rights and freedom of African Americans, and challenge America based off America's foundational principles that we were not living up to at the time. But the picture of the Torah and the Exodus is a little more complicated. The Torah creates two archetypes. The archetype of the Egyptians of the ancient land of Egypt is an archetypical land that takes advantage of the downtrodden, a land and a people who, for economic or political expediency, didn't care about the universality of human worth, and were willing to, just in one generation, take a group of people, the Israelites, who were honored and invited guests in their land, turning them into slaves. And the Torah pits that against the vision and the society that the Israelites subsequently try to create. But we know that the journey from Egypt into Israel was a long one. The Torah describes 40 long years of the Israelites going through the desert, trials and tribulations and failures and setbacks. Often we learn in the biblical narrative in the Torah, as we'll be discussing in future weeks, oftentimes the Israelites, when things were difficult in the desert, actually turned to Moses and said, Moses, we're done with this journey. It's tough out here in the desert. Let's go back to Egypt. It was simpler there. We understood the way that life worked there. But Moses and the Israelites kept on pushing. They kept pushing for 40 years, an entire generational change, until they went from being slaves in the land of Egypt to the freedom of being in the land of Israel. But in Judaism, we know that we don't learn history as a dry academic endeavor. Rather, we have memory. We have ideas that are so embodied within the principles and within our everyday rituals of Judaism that it inspires us to act. In Judaism, the Exodus really isn't a one-time event, but it's an ever-continuing process. In the final speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave, roughly 11 hours before he was tragically murdered, Martin Luther King Jr. imagined himself as Moses standing on the mountaintop. We know that Moses, after all he does for the Israelites, after all he does, spending 40 long years taking the Israelites from servitude to freedom, only gets to look out at the future, only gets to look at the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And even as he begs God, even as Moses begs God to let him in, God tells Moses, I'm sorry, your journey ends here, but your descendants, the next generation, will take over from where you left off. And Martin Luther King Jr., in this final speech of his life, he compared himself to Moses as somebody who had taken our society and the civil rights movement through this journey, through this long and difficult journey, one with setbacks. But Martin Luther King Jr. knew and understood that this wasn't the end of the journey. But his life is summed up as a person who did all he can and yet knew that the work wasn't finished. Perhaps the most famous quote of Martin Luther King Jr., which really sums up one of the most important ideas of Judaism. Judaism, a tradition that introduces both the idea of ethical monotheism, of the equality of all humans, and a linear view of history into the world. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words inspire us to look towards the future when he writes, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Shabbat Shalom. We turn to page 586 for Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet gedula liyatzei breshit shehu noteh shamayim v'yaseh ha'aretz Moshe v'kara b'shamayim ma'al u'shchinatu zo b'dvar meramam hu Eloheinu ein od ve'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu shehu noteh shamayim v'yaseh ha'aretz u'Moshe v'kara b'shamayim ma'al u'shchinatu zo b'gavei meramim hu Eloheinu ein od emet makenu efes ulato Kakatuv b'Torato v'yadat hayom v'ashavot el bavacha ki Adonai hu Elohim v'shamayim mima'al ve'al ha'aretz mitachat ein od al ken kablacha Adonai Eloheinu lirot meherah b'tiferet uzecha lahavir giluli min ha'aretz ve'halilim karetu karetu v'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai v'chol b'nei basar karu b'shimcha lahafnot elecha Kodesh haaretz yakiru v'yedu kodesh tevel ki lecha tikra kol berach tishava kol lashon lefanecha Eloheinu yikaru v'yitpalu ulichvot shimcha yikaritenu v'kablu kulam et ol malchutacha v'timloch aleinu v'yara le'olam ba'ed ki ha'malchut shlecha hi u'meyad timloch bechavod kakatuv b'toratecha Adonai yimloch le'olam ba'ed ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. We remain standing and turn to page 598 for the Mourner's Kaddish, and we're especially thinking of all of the recent passings in our own community and anyone who's in the 7-day period, the Shiva period after the death of a family member or loved one, anybody in the Shloshim period, the 30-day period after the passing, or anybody that's commemorating a yahrzeit. Please turn to page 598. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah.
V'yamad divrach chiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh v'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'gala uv'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemid kuresha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehe shalom rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
We invite Steve Blasco to make Kiddush for us tonight.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kadsho b'achava uvratzon hinhilanu zikaron l'maaseh bereshit ki hu yom techila Lemikroe Kodesh, Zecher Letziat Mitzrayim, Kivanu Vacharta, Vyotanu Kidashta, Mikol Hamim, Vishabat Kachecha, Vyachava Uvratzon, Hinhaltanu, Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. L'chaim.
Amen. L'chaim. We conclude services with sanctuary.
בתוכם, ואנחנו נברך יה מעתה ועד עולם. Oh God, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true. With thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope to see you
Shalom.
tomorrow morning.